My dear friends, the passage that we have for our gospel lesson this morning has been much on my mind of late, for the simple reason that events have made my appreciation of Jesus' teaching so much sharper. We will all have seen the protests in London and elsewhere on the theme of Black Lives Matter, and the controversy over statues, not least the one in Bristol that ended up underwater. My thoughts on that were that I agreed with the outcome, but I strongly disagreed with the process, which is why Jesus' teaching has been on my mind. To put it in modern language, what Jesus is criticizing in our passage from the Sermon on the Mount is what we now call virtue signaling. That's when a person does something to demonstrate to other people that they are righteous in some way. Jesus is very clear that if we perform some virtuous act in order to be seen by others, then God is not impressed, and we will gain no heavenly reward for it. On the contrary, we must be so careful to hide our virtue that our left hand must not know what our right hand is doing. No one is to notice our deeds. In Jesus' time, we can see that the Pharisees were trying to outcompete each other in virtue, praying in public, giving charity ostentatiously, showing everyone their spiritual muscles by visibly fasting. Jesus is trying to get people to see that whilst all those things are good things and desired by God, when the motivation for doing them is to appease the crowd, they lead people away from God, not towards Him. The problem comes from doing things for an audience. Audiences are fickle things. They are restless and perpetually unsatisfied, and that means that they will always want more. When our moral compass is set to pleasing a crowd, we have embarked upon a path that will lead through extremes towards a catastrophe. It's what's called a holiness spiral, when people try to compete against each other to win the crowd's favour. Now, if you're familiar with Monty Python's Four Yorkshiremen sketch, that's a good example of the dynamic that I have in mind. Things escalate to an absurd conclusion with Monty Python, but often to a much more frightening conclusion in real life. At what point do the demands stop? Who gets crucified? The only way to come out of that process, to take strength away from it, is to withdraw from the crowd, to not take part, to, as Jesus says here, go into a room by ourselves, shut the door, and pray to our Father in private. That is the right process, the only way in which we will draw closer to God and do God's work in our world. And so it's the only process that will lead to the right outcome. Virtue signaling, that is, playing to the crowd, is forbidden for a Christian. And Jesus is very explicit here about the spiritual danger that it represents. May we each have our hearts set on God, finding our true freedom in seeking to please only Him. Until we meet again, Amen.